Growing up, I always wondered why my parents named me Fatima. It's not that I disliked the name, there's nothing inherently wrong with it. But in a world full of Emilys, Sophies, and Isabels, Fatima felt like a relic from a different time, a name that belonged to someone else. I was the only Fatima in my school, the only Fatima in our village, and possibly the only Fatima for miles around. Why did you choose this name? I asked my mother one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was a brilliant orange, casting a warm glow over our garden, and the air was filled with the scent of blooming jasmine. My mother, Sarah Moore, was a woman of simple elegance. Her hair was always neatly tied back, and her eyes, the same deep brown as mine, had a way of seeing right through me. She looked up from her knitting and smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "Fatima is a strong name," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It's a name that carries weight, that has history. We wanted you to have a name that meant something, that wasn't just chosen because it sounded nice or was popular." "But why not something more modern?" I pressed, twirling a strand of my hair around my finger. "Something that wouldn't make me stand out so much." My mother set down her knitting and turned to face me, her expression serious now. "Do you really think that blending in is better than standing out?" she asked, her tone gentle but probing. "Do you really think that being like everyone else is what you want?" I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. It wasn't that I wanted to be like everyone else, not exactly. But I didn't want to be the odd one out either, the girl with the name that people stumbled over, that they couldn't place. "Your name is special, Fatima," she continued, reaching out to take my hand in hers. "It's a name that comes from your father's side of the family, from his great-grandmother, who was one of the strongest women I've ever known. She was a leader in her community, a woman who never backed down, who always fought for what she believed in." I listened to her words, letting them sink in, but they didn't quite fill the emptiness I felt. It was nice to know that my name had meaning, that it was connected to a strong woman from our past. But it didn't change the fact that I felt out of place in my own skin, like I was wearing a name that didn't quite fit. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about what my mother had said. I thought about the stories I'd heard about my great-great-grandmother, the original Fatima, and how she'd been a force to be reckoned with. But instead of feeling inspired, I felt burdened, like I was carrying a legacy I hadn't asked for. The next morning, I decided to talk to my father about it. He was in the kitchen, sipping his coffee and reading the newspaper when I approached him. My father, James Moore, was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his words carried weight. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a presence that filled the room. His grey hair was always neatly combed, and his blue eyes, a sharp contrast to my mother's, were always calm, always steady. "Dad." I began hesitantly, taking a seat across from him. "Can I ask you something?" He folded the newspaper and set it aside, giving me his full attention. "Of course, Fatima. What's on your mind?" I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "It's about my name," I said finally. I don't understand why you and Mom chose it. I mean, I get that it's special, that it has history, but sometimes I feel like it doesn't belong to me, like I'm living in someone else's shadow." My father's expression softened, and he reached across the table to place his hand over mine. "I know it can be hard," he said quietly, "having a name that's different, that stands out. But your name is part of who you are, Fatima. It's part of your heritage, your identity. It connects you to the women who came before you, to the strength and resilience that's been passed down through generations." "But what if I don't feel that strength?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What if I just feel out of place?" He studied me for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. "Feeling out of place doesn't mean you're not strong," he said gently. "It just means you're still finding your way, still figuring out who you are. And that's okay. It's part of growing up, part of becoming the person you're meant to be." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. I wanted to believe my father's words, wanted to embrace the name I'd been given, but it was hard when I felt so disconnected from it. As I left the kitchen, I couldn't help but wonder if things would have been different if I'd been given a different name, a name that didn't carry so much history, so much weight. But deep down, I knew that it wasn't just the name that made me feel out of place, it was something deeper, something I couldn't quite put into words. And so, I kept my thoughts to myself, burying them deep inside, where they wouldn't trouble anyone else. But they were always there, lurking in the back of my mind, a constant reminder that I wasn't quite sure who I was or where I belonged. Our house stood at the end of the long, winding road that led into the heart of our village. It was an imposing structure, with ivy creeping up its stone walls and a wide wraparound porch that seemed to hug the entire building. This house, with its creaking floors and drafty windows, was more than just a place to live. It was the heart of our family, a living, breathing thing that held generations of memories within its walls. The Moore family had lived in this house for as long as anyone could remember. My grandparents, Robert and Rosie Moore, had raised their children here, and now their children's children were growing up under the same roof. It was a place of comfort, of tradition, where every corner held a story, and every room was filled with echoes of laughter, tears, and love. I often found myself wandering through the house, letting my fingers trail along the worn wooden banister, or pausing to admire the collection of family photographs that lined the walls. Each photo told a story: my grandparents on their wedding day, my mother and her siblings as children, and even my older sister, Melanie, holding her newborn son, James Jr. One evening, as I stood in the hallway, staring at a photo of my grandparents, I heard the familiar sound of my grandmother's voice echoing down the hall. "Fatima, darling, come help me in the kitchen," she called, her voice warm and inviting. I made my way to the kitchen, where I found my grandmother, Rosie, bustling about, preparing dinner. Despite her age, she moved with the grace and energy of a much younger woman. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and she wore a bright floral apron over her dress, a splash of color in the otherwise neutral kitchen. "Need some help, Grandma?" I asked, stepping up to the counter. She turned to me with a smile, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Always, my dear. Why don't you start by chopping those vegetables?" As I began to chop, I watched her out of the corner of my eye, admiring the way she moved so effortlessly around the kitchen. There was something about her that always captivated me, something about the way she carried herself that made her seem almost timeless. "Grandma," I began hesitantly, "can I ask you something?" She glanced at me over her shoulder, her expression curious. "Of course, darling. What's on your mind?" I paused, unsure of how to phrase my question. "Do you ever feel out of place? Like you don't quite belong?" Her hands stilled for a moment, and she turned to face me fully, her expression softening. "Oh, Fatima," she said gently, "I think everyone feels that way at some point in their life. It's part of growing up, part of figuring out who you are." "But you always seem so confident," I said, setting down the knife and turning to face her. "You moved here from Los Angeles, a big city, and adapted so easily. You always look so put together, like you belong here, like this was always where you were meant to be." A wistful smile tapped at her lips as she wiped her hands on her apron and leaned against the counter. "It wasn't always easy," she admitted. "When I first moved here, I felt out of place too. This village, this house, it was so different from what I was used to. But then I met your grandfather, and everything changed." She paused, her eyes distant, as if she were looking back in time. "Your grandfather is a remarkable man. He made me feel like I belonged, like this was exactly where I was meant to be. And over time, I came to love this place, this house, because it wasn't just a house, it was a home, a place filled with love and memories." I listened to her words, letting them sink in, but I still felt that gnawing sense of displacement. But what if you still feel out of place, even after all these years? Rosie's eyes softened, and she reached out to cup my cheek, her touch warm and reassuring. "You're still young, Fatima. You're still finding your way. It's okay to feel unsure, to feel like you don't quite belong. But I promise you, one day, you'll find your place, and when you do, you'll know it in your heart." I nodded, but I couldn't help but wonder when that day would come. I wanted to feel the way my grandmother did, to feel like this house, this village, was where I was meant to be. But instead, I felt like a visitor, someone who was just passing through. Later that evening after dinner, I sat with my grandfather, Robert, in the living room. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his words carried weight. He was sitting in his favorite armchair, a book in his hands, but he looked up as I entered the room. "Ah, Fatima," he said, his voice deep and steady. "Come, sit with me." I took a seat on the couch across from him, tucking my legs beneath me. "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" He set his book aside and gave me his full attention, his blue eyes thoughtful. "Of course, my dear. What is it?" "Did you ever think about leaving this village?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Did you ever want to live somewhere else?" He was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant, as if he were considering my question carefully. "There was a time when I thought about it," he admitted finally. "When I was young, I dreamed of seeing the world, of leaving this village behind. But then I met your grandmother, and everything changed." His eyes softened as he spoke of her, and I could see the deep love he had for her in every line of his face. She was like a breath of fresh air, like nothing I'd ever seen before. She made me see this village, this house, in a new light. And I realized that it wasn't about where I was, it was about who I was with. I nodded, understanding what he meant, but it didn't ease the restlessness I felt inside. "But what if you still feel like you don't belong?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and looked at me intently. "You belong, Fatima. You belong here, in this house, with this family. You may not see it now, but this house, this village, they're a part of you. And one day you'll see that." I smiled, trying to take comfort in his words, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something missing, something I hadn't yet found. And as I went to bed that night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I would ever truly feel like this house, this village, was where I was meant to be. Growing up, I always felt like I was living in Melani's shadow. My older sister was everything I wasn't: confident, beautiful, and effortlessly graceful. She had this magnetic presence that drew people to her, while I was more reserved, often content to observe from the sidelines. Everyone in our village adored Melanie, and it wasn't hard to see why. She had a way of making everyone feel special, like they were the only person in the room when she spoke to them. Melanie was the golden child, the one who had it all figured out. She married young, to a man named James, who was as charming as he was handsome. Together, they seemed like the perfect couple, the kind you'd see in a glossy magazine. And now, with their son, James Jr., their family seemed like something out of a fairy tale. Meanwhile, I was still struggling to figure out who I was, where I fit in. The more I tried to carve out my own identity, the more I felt overshadowed by Melanie's brilliance. It was as if every achievement, every moment of recognition I had, was somehow dimmed by the fact that I was Melanie's sister. One afternoon, I found myself sitting with Melanie on the porch, watching the sun dip low in the sky. James Jr. was playing in the yard, his laughter ringing out as he chased a butterfly. Melanie was sipping iced tea, her hair falling in perfect waves over her shoulders. "You're awfully quiet today," she remarked, glancing over at me. I shrugged, trying to brush off the heaviness I felt, just thinking. "About what?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to open up, but something about the calm of the evening made me feel like I could. "About how different we are," I said finally. She raised an eyebrow, a small smile playing on her lips. "How so?" "You just seem so sure of everything," I said, struggling to find the right words. "You have it all together, Melanie. The perfect husband, the perfect child, the perfect life. And I'm just trying to figure out who I am." Melanie set her glass down and turned to face me fully, her expression softening. "Fatima, no one has it all together, not even me. I might look like I do, but trust me, I have my own struggles." I looked at her skeptically, finding it hard to believe that someone as perfect as Melanie could possibly feel uncertain about anything. "Like what?" She sighed, looking out at the yard where James Jr. was now sitting in the grass, examining the butterfly that had landed on his hand. "Like being a mother, for one. Everyone thinks it's this beautiful, natural thing, but sometimes it's exhausting, and I feel like I'm doing everything wrong. Or like being the perfect wife. James and I have our arguments, our tough days, just like everyone else." I was surprised by her honesty, by the vulnerability in her voice. "But you make it look so easy," I said softly. "That's the thing," she said, turning back to me. "We all put on this facade, this image of what we think life should look like, but underneath it, we're all just figuring things out as we go. Just because I seem confident doesn't mean I don't have my doubts, my insecurities." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I'd always seen Melanie as this untouchable figure, someone who had everything I lacked. But hearing her admit to her own struggles made me realize that maybe I wasn't so different from her after all. "You're not in my shadow, Fatima," Melanie said quietly, as if reading my thoughts. "You're your own person, and you have your own path to follow. It might not look like mine, but that doesn't mean it's any less important." Her words hung in the air between us, and for the first time, I felt like maybe I could step out of her shadow, that maybe it wasn't as big as I'd always imagined. But there was still that part of me that felt lost, that was searching for something I couldn't quite define. "Do you ever feel out of place?" I asked, echoing the question I'd asked our grandmother just a few days before. Melanie was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. "Sometimes," she admitted. "I think we all do at some point. But I've learned that it's okay to feel that way. It just means you're growing, that you're searching for where you're meant to be." I nodded, trying to take comfort in her words, but it was hard to shake the feeling that I was still just drifting, that I was still living in the shadow of the sister who seemed to have it all figured out. As the evening wore on and the sky turned from gold to deep indigo, I found myself reflecting on Melanie's words. Maybe I didn't need to compare myself to her or to anyone else. Maybe my path was different, and that was okay. But even as I tried to convince myself of this, the uncertainty lingered, a small persistent voice in the back of my mind. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Melanie's life, about the expectations that had been placed on her from a young age. She had always been the one everyone looked up to, the one everyone admired. And while that had brought her praise and adoration, it had also brought pressure, the kind of pressure I wasn't sure I could handle. Maybe Melanie's shadow wasn't as much of a burden as I'd thought. Maybe it was just a reflection of my own insecurities, of my own fears of not being enough. But as much as I wanted to believe that, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd ever truly find my place, if I'd ever step out of that shadow and into my own light. Growing up, I was always captivated by my grandmother Rosie. She was a force of nature, a woman whose mere presence could light up a room. Unlike the other women in our village, who wore simple dresses and kept their hair pulled back in practical buns, Rosie was always impeccably dressed, her hair perfectly styled in soft waves that framed her face. She had a flair for fashion that was undeniable, a talent for taking the ordinary and making it extraordinary. Rosie was a woman of contradictions. Despite having lived in our small, remote village for decades, she still carried herself with the elegance and sophistication of someone who had just stepped off a Hollywood set. Yet she was never out of place here. Somehow, she had managed to blend the glamour of her past life with the simplicity of village life, creating a world that was uniquely her own. I remember one afternoon, sitting in the sunroom with Rosie, the light filtering through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the floor. Rosie was arranging flowers in a crystal vase, her fingers moving deftly as she adjusted each stem. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" I ventured, watching her work. "Of course, darling," she replied without looking up, her attention focused on the flowers. "Why did you choose to stay here? I mean, you could have gone back to Los Angeles, or anywhere else really, but you stayed." Rosie paused, turning to face me with a gentle smile. "Ah, Los Angeles. It seems like a lifetime ago." She took a seat next to me, her eyes growing distant as she recalled memories of her past. "When I first came here, I didn't plan on staying forever. I thought I'd help your grandfather for a few months and then head back to the city. But something happened that I didn't expect." "What was that?" I asked, leaning in, eager to hear more. "I fell in love," she said simply, a warmth spreading across her features. "Not just with your grandfather, though that was part of it. I fell in love with the people, the pace of life, the sense of community. Los Angeles was fast, exciting, but it was also lonely. Here, I felt connected, rooted in a way I never had before." I studied her, trying to reconcile the glamorous woman before me with the idea of someone who chose a simple village life over the allure of the city. "But don't you miss it? The excitement, the lights, the fashion?" Rosie laughed, a soft, melodic sound that filled the room. "Oh, I still have my moments when I miss the thrill of it all. But I've learned that true happiness doesn't come from where you are, but from who you're with. Your grandfather made this place home for me. He showed me that love, real love, doesn't need the glitz and glamour. It just needs two people who are willing to share their lives with each other." Her words struck a chord with me. I'd always seen Rosie as this larger-than-life figure, someone who belonged to a world far beyond our village. But hearing her speak so fondly of her life here made me realize that perhaps I'd been wrong. Maybe Rosie's world wasn't just about the fashion and the glamour. Maybe it was about something much deeper, something I hadn't fully understood until now. As if sensing my thoughts, Rosie reached out and took my hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "Fatima, I know you've been struggling to find your place, to figure out who you are. But let me tell you something I've learned over the years. You don't have to fit into anyone else's idea of who you should be. You just have to be yourself, and the rest will fall into place." I nodded, absorbing her words, though a part of me still felt uncertain. But what if I don't know who that is yet? Rosie smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's the beauty of life, my dear. You don't have to have all the answers right now. It's okay to explore, to try new things, to make mistakes. That's how you find yourself." Her words were comforting, but I still felt a lingering sense of doubt. But what if I never figure it out? What if I'm just lost? "You won't be lost forever," Rosie assured me. "Everyone feels that way at some point. But eventually, you'll find your way. And when you do, you'll realize that every step of the journey was leading you to where you're meant to be." We sat in silence for a while after that, the only sound the soft rustling of the wind through the trees outside. I thought about Rosie's life, about the choices she'd made and the path she'd followed. She had lived in two worlds, one of glamour and one of simplicity, and had found a way to bridge the gap between them. It made me wonder if maybe I could do the same, if I could find a way to blend the different parts of myself into something whole. Later that evening, as we gathered around the dinner table, I watched Rosie and my grandfather interact. There was a quiet ease between them, a deep understanding that came from years of shared experiences. They didn't need to say much to communicate. A simple glance or a slight smile was enough. As we ate, my grandfather looked over at Rosie, his expression softening as he spoke. "Remember that time we got caught in the rain on the way to the market?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. Rosie laughed, her eyes sparkling with the memory. "How could I forget? We were soaked to the bone, and you insisted on dancing in the rain." "You looked so beautiful, I couldn't resist," he said, reaching out to take her hand. "You still do." Rosie blushed, a rare sight, and squeezed his hand in return. "You old charmer," she teased, but her smile was genuine, filled with love. Watching them, I felt a pain of longing, a desire to find something as real and enduring as what they had. It wasn't just the romance that I envied. It was the deep connection, the unwavering support they gave each other. They had built a life together, one that was full of love, laughter, and the occasional argument, but always with a foundation of mutual respect and affection. After dinner, as I was helping Rosie clear the table, she turned to me and said, "You know, Fatima, you remind me a lot of myself when I was your age." "Really?" I asked, surprised. "But you're so confident, so sure of who you are." Rosie chuckled. "I wasn't always this way. It took me a long time to find my place in the world, to figure out who I wanted to be. But once I did, I realized that all the uncertainty, all the doubts and fears, they were just part of the journey." Her words stayed with me long after I went to bed that night. Rosie had created a world for herself, one that was rich with love and meaning. It wasn't the world she had expected to live in, but it was one she had chosen, one she had made her own. And maybe, just maybe, I could do the same. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about the stories Rosie had shared with me, about the life she had lived before and the life she had now. I realized that Rosie's world wasn't just about the clothes she wore or the way she styled her hair. It was about the choices she had made, the people she had loved, and the life she had built with my grandfather. And in that moment, I felt a glimmer of hope that I, too, could find my place in the world, that I could step out of Melani's shadow and create a life that was uniquely mine. A life that, like Rosie's, was full of love, laughter, and a sense of belonging that came not from where I was, but from who I was with and who I was becoming. The sun had barely risen over the village, casting long shadows across the fields, when I found myself walking toward the old barn behind our house. It wasn't a place I usually visited. The barn was more my grandfather's domain, a space filled with tools, old farming equipment, and memories of a man who had built a life with his own two hands. But that morning, something drew me there, as if I was searching for a piece of my grandfather that I hadn't yet understood. When I pushed open the heavy wooden door, the familiar smell of hay and earth greeted me. The barn was quiet, save for the soft cooing of pigeons roosting in the rafters. Sunlight streamed in through the cracks in the walls, illuminating dust motes that floated lazily in the air. In the corner, I spotted my grandfather, Robert Moore, hunched over a workbench, his strong hands carefully sanding down a piece of wood. "Morning, Grandpa," I called out softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned slowly, a smile spreading across his weathered face as he recognized me. "Morning, Fatima. What brings you out here so early?" "I just wanted to see what you were up to," I replied, stepping closer to the workbench. "What are you working on?" Robert glanced down at the piece of wood in his hands, then back at me. "Just a little project I've been meaning to finish. Your grandmother's been asking for a new shelf for her plants, so I figured I'd make one for her." I watched as he continued sanding, his movements deliberate and steady. It was a simple task, but the care he put into it was evident. My grandfather had always been like that, patient, methodical, and deeply committed to whatever he set his mind to. It was one of the many qualities I admired about him. "Grandpa," I began hesitantly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart," he replied without looking up from his work. "What's on your mind?" I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. "I've been thinking a lot about our family lately. About you and Grandma and the life you've built here. How did you know this was what you wanted? To stay in the village, to raise a family here?" Robert paused, setting the sandpaper down and turning to face me fully. His eyes, a deep shade of blue that had only softened with age, met mine. "That's a good question, Fatima. The truth is, I didn't always know. When I was younger, I had dreams of leaving this place, of seeing the world beyond our little village. But life has a way of guiding you, if you let it." He gestured for me to sit on a nearby stool, and I did, eager to hear more. "When I met your grandmother, everything changed. Suddenly, the idea of leaving didn't seem so appealing anymore. Rosie brought something into my life that I hadn't realized I was missing, a sense of purpose, of belonging. She was my anchor, the reason I stayed." I nodded, absorbing his words. "But didn't you ever feel like you were giving up on your dreams? Like you were settling?" Robert chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that echoed in the quiet barn. "I suppose I did at first. But then I realized something important. Dreams aren't always about where you go or what you do. Sometimes they're about who you share your life with. My dream wasn't about traveling the world. It was about building a life with the woman I loved, raising a family, and leaving behind something that would last long after I'm gone." He reached over and patted my hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "And you know what, Fatima? I think I made the right choice." His words struck a chord with me. I had always seen my grandfather as a man of few words, someone who kept his thoughts and feelings to himself. But in that moment, I realized just how much wisdom he carried, how deeply he understood the value of the life he had built. "But what about now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever think about what will happen when you're gone? About what kind of legacy you'll leave behind?" Robert's expression softened, and he looked at me with a tenderness that brought tears to my eyes. "Of course I do, Fatima. Every day. But I'm not worried. I know that the love your grandmother and I have shared, the family we've raised, that's our legacy. It's not about buildings or money or fame. It's about the values we've instilled in all of you, the importance of family, of hard work, of kindness. That's what we'll live on." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the open barn door, where the first rays of sunlight were beginning to warm the earth. "And I see that in you, Fatima. You might not realize it yet, but you carry that legacy with you. In the way you care for others, in the way you question the world around you. You're a part of something bigger than yourself, and one day you'll pass that on to the next generation." His words filled me with a sense of pride and responsibility that I hadn't felt before. I had always admired my grandfather, but now I understood just how much he had sacrificed and how deeply he cared for our family. He wasn't just a farmer or a carpenter, he was the foundation upon which our lives were built, the steady hand that had guided us all these years. "Thank you, Grandpa," I said softly, my voice thick with emotion. "I don't think I've ever told you how much I appreciate everything you've done for us. For me." Robert smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You don't have to thank me, Fatima. Seeing you grow into the person you are today is thanks enough." We sat there in companionable silence for a while, the weight of his words settling over me like a warm blanket. I realized then that my grandfather's legacy wasn't something tangible. It wasn't a grand gesture or a monumental achievement. It was in the small things, the way he loved my grandmother, the way he cared for our family, the way he poured his heart into everything he did. As I stood to leave, Robert stopped me, his hand resting gently on my arm. "Fatima, one more thing," he said, his tone serious. "Yes, Grandpa." "Don't be afraid to make your own choices," he said, looking me squarely in the eye. "Your path might be different from mine, and that's okay. But whatever you do, do it with all your heart. That's the best legacy you can leave." His words stayed with me as I left the barn and walked back toward the house. The morning air was crisp and cool, the sky a brilliant shade of blue. I felt a renewed sense of purpose, a desire to honor my grandfather's legacy by finding my own way in the world, by living a life that was true to who I was. And as I crossed the threshold into the warmth of our home, I knew that no matter where life took me, I would carry Robert's legacy with me. A legacy of love, of commitment, and of a life well lived. Life in our village had a way of moving slowly, like the gentle flow of the river that wound its way through the fields. The days were marked by the steady rhythm of chores, the hum of daily conversations, and the simple joys that came with living in a place where everyone knew your name. For as long as I could remember, I had taken this pace for granted, thinking it was too slow, too predictable. But as I grew older, I began to understand the beauty in the quiet life, the way it allowed room for reflection, connection, and a deeper appreciation of the world around us. One crisp autumn morning, I found myself sitting on the front porch, a cup of tea in hand, as the sun began to rise over the hills. The air was cool, with just a hint of the coming winter, and the sky was painted in soft hues of pink and gold. I watched as the village slowly came to life, the smoke curling from chimneys, and the distant sound of roosters crowing. It was a scene I had witnessed countless times, yet it never lost its charm. My thoughts drifted back to the conversation I had with Grandpa Robert in the barn just a few days earlier. His words had left a lasting impression on me, and I found myself thinking more and more about the life I wanted to live, the legacy I wanted to leave behind. In the quiet of the morning, it was easier to listen to those thoughts, to sift through the noise and find the truth within. Just then, the screen door creaked open, and my grandmother, Rosie, stepped out onto the porch. She was wrapped in a light shawl, her silver hair neatly pinned back, and as always, she carried herself with a grace that belied her years. "Morning, darling," she greeted me with a warm smile, settling into the chair beside me. "Morning, Grandma," I replied, returning her smile. "How did you sleep?" "Like a baby," she said with a wink, though your grandfather's snoring almost put an end to that. I chuckled, taking a sip of my tea. It's hard to imagine Grandpa snoring. He's always so composed. Rosie laughed softly. "Oh, you'd be surprised, my dear. Even the most composed men have their moments." We sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the village wake up. The stillness between us was comforting, a testament to the years we had spent together in this place. Finally, I turned to her, curiosity getting the better of me. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart," she replied, her eyes warm and attentive. "Do you ever miss the city? I mean, you left Los Angeles, a place full of excitement and opportunities, to live here. Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had stayed?" Rosie's expression softened, and she looked out across the fields, as if seeing the past unfold before her eyes. "You know, Fatima, I do think about that sometimes. There's a part of me that will always love the city, the energy, the lights, the endless possibilities. But I've never regretted my decision to come here." I nodded, listening intently as she continued. "When I met your grandfather, I was at a crossroads in my life. I had dreams, big dreams, of becoming someone important. But when I fell in love with Robert, I realized that my dreams didn't have to be tied to a place or a career. They could be about building a life with someone I loved, about creating a home where our family could grow and thrive." She paused, her gaze meeting mine, and that's exactly what we did. This village may be small, but it's filled with people who care for one another, who look out for each other. That sense of community, of belonging, it's something I wouldn't trade for all the excitement in the world. I thought about her words, about the choices she had made and the life she had built. In many ways, her story mirrored my grandfather's, two people who had chosen love and family over ambition and adventure, and who had found fulfillment in the quiet life they had created together. But don't you ever get restless? I asked, my voice tinged with my own uncertainties. Don't you ever want more? Rosie reached over and took my hand in hers, her grip firm but gentle. Of course I do sometimes, we all do. But I've learned that more isn't always what we think it is. More doesn't always mean bigger or better. Sometimes it's about finding contentment in the life you have, about recognizing the blessings right in front of you. She smiled at me, her eyes twinkling with the wisdom that came from a life well lived. Fatima, you're young and you have your whole life ahead of you. It's natural to want to explore, to seek out new experiences. But don't be in such a hurry to find more that you overlook the beauty of what you already have. Her words struck a chord with me, echoing the sentiments my grandfather had shared. There was a serenity in the way she spoke, a quiet confidence that came from knowing who she was and what she valued. It was a lesson I was still learning, but one that I knew would guide me in the years to come. As the morning light grew brighter, the village fully awake now, I realized how much I had been taking for granted. The quiet life, with its steady rhythms and simple pleasures, was not a life of limitation, but one of depth and meaning. It was a life that allowed for growth, for connection, and for the kind of love that could sustain a family through generations. Thank you, Grandma, I said softly, squeezing her hand. For everything. Rosie smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. You're welcome, my dear. And remember, whatever path you choose, make sure it's one that brings you peace. That's the true measure of a life well lived. I nodded, her words settling into my heart like seeds that would one day bear fruit. As I sat there beside her, watching the world go by, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. A calm that came from understanding that the quiet life wasn't something to be escaped, but something to be embraced. And in that moment, I knew that no matter where my journey took me, I would always carry a piece of this village, this family, and the lessons they had taught me. The quiet life, with all its subtleties and nuances, was a gift, one that I would cherish for the rest of my days.